Hello, and welcome to this video, a primer on yeast varieties. This video is a long overdue primer on yeast varieties. Previous videos have specified particular yeast strains, particularly the SN9 by Vintner's Harvest and the Still Spirits Turbo yeast. So what makes these yeast strains special, and why are they specifically suited to one or more applications? First, there are several large companies dedicated to finding, maintaining, and creating yeast strains, the two largest of which are Yeast and White Labs. Finding the local brew shop or a reliable online retailer and identifying which of them are available is the first step in selecting yeast. If possible, talk with local brewers either online or in local groups who can advise you on the strains best suited to your local conditions. An example of this: the local temperature can drop quite low in winter. This requires the use of a lager yeast if it is brewed without heat or insulation. As a counterpoint to this, a high temperature fermenting yeast can be used in environments that get quite warm during summer. Once you know which companies are available, it opens the option of selecting a reliable and readily available yeast strain. For a beginner, it is a good idea to start with dry yeast. This resembles baker's yeast. Seen here is the roughly 50 by 90 mm vacuum sealed yeast pack. This keeps the yeast fresh and stable for a longer time. In comparison to liquid yeast, it is easier to store and remains stable despite mistreatment. The alternative is liquid yeast. Liquid yeast comes as either a dual chamber that you break like a hand warmer, or as a vial filled with yeast and a nutrient broth. These are live, active yeast cells that can be pitched immediately without any worries. Unfortunately, it has to be kept alive, fed, and in the case of vials, grown up before you can economically pitch it. For the purposes of an introduction, this video will describe only a limited range of dry yeast. It is cut down from roughly 500 commercially available strains. On top of these 500, there are far more craft strains available. Of the yeast types described so far, they are further defined by two categories: top fermenting and bottom fermenting. Top fermenting yeast is generally regarded as top fermenting since they rise to the surface during fermentation, creating a very thick, rich yeast head. As a rule, top yeast ferments between 18 to 20 degrees centigrade, and it is formally known as Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It is also generally used in ale. The other option is your bottom fermenting yeast. This grows less rapidly than ale yeast, and with less surface foam, they tend to settle at the bottom of the fermenter as fermentation completes. As a rule, bottom yeast ferments at 7 to 15 degrees centigrade, and it is formally known as Saccharomyces uvarum. There is a third yeast type used in Bavarian wheat beer, but it has aspects deserving of an independent video. If you have a preferred beer type, it is possible to harvest the yeast from this. The yeast can then be propagated to create a usable quantity. The remainder can then be further propagated and stored in a cold environment for several weeks to months for use later. This is the simplest source of yeast, if you wish to recreate your preferred beer or cider. As a general rule for beer yeast, and further lager yeast, the SAF Lager 23 and SAF Lager 34/70 is used in winter, as this has a low temperature fermentation. This is due to the low temperature tolerances, and the yeast can work between 9 and 22 degrees centigrade. The ideal temperature range is 12 to 15 degrees centigrade, and was selected based on the cold weather in winter and the ability to ferment in a reasonably exposed environment. The ale yeast selected is the SAF Brew S33. This is an example of a high temperature yeast. This has a higher temperature yeast strain and works between 12 and 25 degrees centigrade. The ideal range is 15 to 20 degrees centigrade. This is selected based on the sheltered environment in summer, where heat is less of a concern, but it still has an impact on fermentation. This is also suitable for use in a kitchen, which is regularly kept warm. Next is the sparkling wine yeast. This comes in several varieties of relevance, and they apply to cider. The Y yeast 4021 strain has been used successfully for this. Other strains are more readily available and have since replaced the Y yeast. This ferments between 13 and 24 degrees and is a reliable, useful starter. In-house, the Vintner's Harvest SN9 has been used in sake and cider across multiple temperature ranges, and it produces up to 18% alcohol, between 10 and 18 degrees centigrade. This led to the red wine selection. For red wine, the Vintner's Harvest R56 is used. It ferments between 22 and 30 degrees centigrade. This suits the summer temperature ranges and produces up to 13.5% alcohol by volume. It is also very flexible in the substrate that can be used, meaning it is a more utilitarian yeast strain than others available. The final yeast strain used in-house is for alcohol production. The Still Spirits Turbo Yeast is a reliable, affordable yeast strain for brewing ethanol. It works in a range of temperatures and produces up to 20% alcohol by volume. Alternatively, currently the Red Star Premier Cuvée yeast is being tested for the same purpose, as it is also very flexible, much like the R56. You will find a link in the bottom of this video in the description box for a list of yeast strains in the Brew Your Own website. This is a useful reference tool. If you're just starting out brewing, it is worthwhile finding a group of like-minded individuals and sharing the cost of buying a large number of yeast strains. Doing so will allow the yeast to be propagated for a new brew, and then divided, stored, and experimented with as needed. The above-mentioned strains are for reference only, and to give you an idea of the traits you are looking for in your first yeast selection. These traits being flexibility in application and suitability for the environment you are brewing in. As your ability grows, it will be necessary to acquire more strains for a varied and specific flavor profile in your brew. The reason you will be looking for a specific flavor profile is that each yeast strain will have its own particular substrate preference and byproducts produced during fermentation that will significantly alter the flavor outcomes. By having both a selection available and the right mixture inside the brew itself, it will alter the flavor, and it will also require that you understand what you're pitching and how you're pitching it in the right quantities. Thank you for watching this video. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you may have below.